A human face emerged from a Moroccan hillside with features that seemed far too familiar for the deep past. Its brow was strong and the skull incomplete, but the preserved facial bones belonged close to the broad pattern associated with Homo sapiens. Then researchers established its age. The remains were not 40,000 years old, or even 100,000. The principal estimate placed the occupation at approximately 315,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of about 34,000 years in either direction. Even at the younger end of that range, the implication was difficult to avoid. People with several derived Homo sapiens facial characteristics had lived in northwestern Africa far earlier than the site's first interpretation suggested. The fossils did not prove that Morocco was the single birthplace of humanity. They did not identify the direct ancestors of every person alive today. But they exposed a contradiction within the familiar origin story. If important Homo sapiens features were already present this far west, at such an early date, then our species may not have appeared suddenly and fully formed within one small, isolated region. Its emergence may have been slower, more uneven, and distributed across a much larger African landscape. The mystery began in 1961 at Jebel Irhoud, a limestone site west of Morocco's Atlas Mountains. Mining activity disturbed the hillside and exposed the first human skull. It was not recovered from a carefully excavated archaeological layer. The surrounding ground had already been broken apart by industrial work, weakening the relationships between the fossil, nearby artifacts, sediment, animal remains, and traces of fire. Those relationships matter because an archaeological object does not carry its entire history inside itself. Its position within a layer can reveal when it was deposited, what occurred around it, and whether other discoveries truly belong to the same period. The skull preserved anatomy. The disturbed hillside preserved far less certainty. Without a reliable date, researchers tried to place the remains by comparing their shape with other known fossils and by examining the stone tools recovered from the site. The result was not one clear answer, but several competing possibilities. Some researchers described the fossils as African Neanderthals. Others regarded them as archaic humans from a much later period, perhaps only tens of thousands of years old. The anatomy contained features that appeared both familiar and unusual, while the associated tools resembled technologies then believed to belong relatively late in prehistory. The evidence could be arranged into different stories because the site lacked a dependable clock. The remains might have belonged to a late-surviving archaic population. They might have lived closer to the period when more recent forms of Homo sapiens were spreading through Africa. Some interpretations even connected aspects of their anatomy with populations related to Neanderthals. For decades, Jebel Irhoud remained suspended between those possibilities. The fossils were genuine, but their place in human evolution depended on an age that no one could establish securely. That changed when researchers returned to the site and began excavating deposits that had escaped the earlier mining. The renewed work treated Jebel Irhoud not simply as an old fossil locality requiring a new label, but as an archaeological scene that might still preserve intact relationships. Sediment was removed carefully. Fossils and artifacts were recorded within their layers. Evidence that had once been separated could now be examined together. More human remains appeared, including portions of skulls, jaws, and teeth. Combined with the earlier finds, they represented at least 5 individuals, adults, a younger individual, and a child. No complete skeleton survived. No single undamaged skull offered an untouched portrait of someone who had lived there. The fossils were fragmentary, and reconstructing parts of their anatomy required researchers to correct for damage, compare separate pieces, and draw on other human remains. But the expanded collection changed the investigation. Jebel Irhoud was no longer represented by one puzzling skull from uncertain ground. It now contained evidence of several people associated with stone artifacts, animal bones, and traces of fire within a controlled archaeological sequence. Among the artifacts were pieces of flint shaped through prepared core techniques associated with the African Middle Stone Age. Their form revealed deliberate and skilled stoneworking. Their exposure to fire provided something even more valuable. Strong heating had reset energy stored within the flint's mineral structure. After burial, natural radiation gradually caused that energy to accumulate again. By reheating the artifacts in a laboratory and measuring the faint light released, researchers could estimate how much time had passed since the earlier heating event. The method, known as thermoluminescence dating, did not identify the exact day someone placed a piece of flint near a fire. It produced an estimate with a range of uncertainty. But unlike the first skull, the heated artifacts came from controlled deposits associated with the newly recovered human remains. Their principal date was approximately 315,000 years ago, plus or minus about 34,000 years. A human tooth examined through a separate dating approach indicated a compatible Middle Pleistocene age. Neither method was absolute, and each depended on its own assumptions. Yet two independent lines of evidence pointed toward the same broad conclusion. The Jebel Irhoud population was not merely older than researchers had first believed. It was older by an enormous margin. That result made the earlier classifications increasingly difficult to sustain. The fossils could no longer be understood comfortably as relatively recent archaic humans, and they did not simply reproduce the characteristic anatomical pattern of classic Neanderthals. Their original interpretation had been shaped by an unusual combination: anatomy that was difficult to place, tools once believed to be younger, and a discovery context too disturbed to provide a reliable chronology. Once renewed excavation connected human remains, heated flint, and surviving archaeological layers, the entire site shifted backward in time. That shift changed more than the date on a label. Before the renewed work at Jebel Irhoud, some of the most influential early Homo sapiens fossils came from Eastern Africa. Remains from sites in Ethiopia had helped create a popular picture in which our species originated in a relatively restricted eastern region before spreading elsewhere. The scientific discussion was always more complex than that simplified image. Fossils were incomplete, dates were revised, and definitions of early Homo sapiens differed among researchers. Still, the idea of a geographically narrow birthplace had become deeply familiar. Jebel Irhoud placed crucial evidence far to the west. Northwestern Africa was not a minor extension of the known story. It was separated from Eastern Africa by immense distances, varied landscapes, and regions that included the Sahara, an environment whose climate had changed repeatedly over time. The new date did not prove that Homo sapiens began in Morocco. A fossil site records the presence of a population, not necessarily the place where every defining trait first evolved. But the remains showed that a surprisingly early population with important Homo sapiens characteristics had lived in a region long treated as peripheral to the species' deepest origins. That raised a question that could not be answered by the age alone. What, exactly, were these people? The research team described the fossils as representing an early phase in the evolution of Homo sapiens. That wording was careful. It did not mean the individuals were anatomically identical to living humans, or that scientists had found a perfectly preserved first generation of our species. Their faces were relatively short and retracted, and several features of the cheeks, jaws, and teeth fell within or close to the broad pattern associated with Homo sapiens. Yet the brain case remained elongated rather than rounded and globular like that of living humans and many later fossils. This difference was anatomical evidence, not a measure of intelligence, language, emotion, or consciousness. Nor did it mean that a recent human face had been attached to the skull of another species. These features belonged to coherent biological individuals whose anatomy suggested that the characteristics used to recognize Homo sapiens had not all developed at the same time. The Jebel Irhoud individuals were therefore not simply late survivors from an older population, accidentally buried beside younger tools. The renewed excavations, the controlled deposits, the heated flint, and the independent evidence from a human tooth all pointed toward a much earlier reality. These people had lived during an ancient phase of human evolution when the anatomical pattern of Homo sapiens was still taking shape. And inside their skulls lay the next mystery. How could a face already look broadly familiar while the brain case behind it still retained a much older form? The answer begins with the realization that a human skull is not one feature, but many. The face, jaw, teeth, cranial vault, and base of the skull form one connected anatomy. Yet over evolutionary time, these regions do not have to change at the same rate. At Jebel Irhoud, they preserve different signals from the past. The face is the most immediately familiar. Compared with many earlier human fossils, it is relatively short and retracted beneath the front of the brain case. It does not project forward as strongly. The cheek region also falls closer to the broad pattern seen in Homo sapiens, lacking some of the heavy forward extension found in other archaic human forms. This is why the Jebel Irhoud remains are often described as having a modern-looking face. But that phrase does not mean the individuals were anatomically identical to people living today. Their brows remained pronounced, their proportions were not fully recent, and several features still fell outside the usual range of living humans. The resemblance lies in the underlying structure of the face, not in an exact modern appearance. The contrast existed within one coherent anatomy, different regions of which preserved different evolutionary signals. The jaws and teeth add to that pattern. The fossil collection includes mandibles and dental remains from several individuals. Their teeth were large compared with those of many living people, but aspects of their crowns, roots, and arrangement helped distinguish them from classic Neanderthal anatomy and supported their placement near the early development of Homo sapiens. The lower jaw does not provide a simple answer. It lacks the strongly projecting chin associated with many later humans, yet its form does not fit neatly within an older category either. Each feature contributes only part of the evidence. The relatively retracted face points toward Homo sapiens. Aspects of the teeth point in the same direction. The brow, jaw, and cranial vault retain conditions that appear more archaic. The classification depends on the combination. This led the research team to interpret the remains as representing an early phase of Homo sapiens, rather than people anatomically identical to us. Other researchers have debated how broadly the name should be applied to fossils this ancient. Some favor a narrower definition based on a more complete set of recent human traits. Others accept that the earliest members of the lineage may have displayed much greater variation. The disagreement reflects a deeper difficulty in the fossil record. Species names create useful boundaries, but biological change does not necessarily respect sharp divisions. Populations alter gradually across generations. They can separate, develop different characteristics, reconnect, and exchange inherited traits. The categories used by researchers organize that history, but they do not turn it into a sequence of sudden transformations. At Jebel Irhoud, the unevenness becomes clearest behind the face. The cranial vault is longer and lower than the rounded form characteristic of living Homo sapiens and many later fossils. Instead of rising into a compact, globular shape, it extends backward. The distinction concerns shape more than simple brain size. A brain case can enclose a substantial volume and still be elongated. The later globular form reflects changes in the growth and organization of the skull, including the relationship among the face, the cranial base, and the bones surrounding the brain. Jebel Irhoud appears to preserve an earlier stage of that development. The shape is scientifically important, but it cannot reveal the quality of the mind once contained within it. An elongated brain case does not demonstrate lower intelligence, limited language, reduced emotion, or lesser consciousness. Fossil skulls can preserve evidence of anatomical organization. They cannot recover thoughts, beliefs, memories, or exact mental abilities. The ancient mind of the title is therefore a narrative contrast, not a literal diagnosis. What is ancient is the form of the brain case. The inner life of the people remains beyond direct observation. Yet the contrast still carries a powerful evolutionary message. If several features of the face had already moved toward the Homo sapiens condition while the brain case remained elongated, then the familiar anatomy of our species did not appear as one indivisible package. This is Mosaic evolution. Different traits can change at different rates. Facial structure may shift while the cranial vault retains an older form. Teeth and jaws may follow different paths. Body proportions, technology, and behavior can also develop according to separate pressures and histories. There is no biological rule requiring every characteristic to cross an invisible boundary at the same moment. Evolution does not move along a ladder toward a predetermined design. It does not pass through fixed stages of improvement, and it does not require one generation in which a fully modern child suddenly appears to parents belonging to another kind of human. Populations remain viable in their own time. Their traits are shaped by inheritance, variation, environmental pressures, chance, isolation, and contact. From the perspective of later observers, a fossil may appear to combine older and newer characteristics. For the living individual, those characteristics formed one complete body. Jebel Irhoud may preserve precisely such a mosaic. Several facial and dental features associated with Homo sapiens were already present, while the cranial vault had not yet acquired the more globular form typical of later populations. The face may therefore have changed before the brain case reached its more recent shape. That interpretation does not make the individuals unfinished humans. It shows that the anatomical pattern later regarded as characteristic of our species developed over an extended period. The fossil evidence must still be handled with care because it is incomplete. Jebel Irhoud did not produce one perfectly preserved skull containing every relevant feature. The collection consists of separate crania, fragments, jaws, and teeth. Some bones were distorted after burial, and others are missing important sections. Researchers used preserved anatomy, symmetry, the relationships among bones, and comparisons with other fossils to reconstruct portions of the skulls. Digital techniques allowed fragments to be repositioned, distortion to be reduced, and missing areas to be estimated. These methods can recover valuable anatomical information. They can test whether fragments fit together and help researchers compare proportions that would otherwise remain obscured. But a reconstructed skull is not an untouched fossil. The more bone that survives, the narrower the range of interpretation. Where large sections are absent, the uncertainty becomes greater. Scientific analysis must therefore separate directly preserved anatomy from restored or estimated regions. The same limitation applies to facial reconstruction. A sculpted or digital face can illustrate the proportions suggested by the bones, including the profile, brow, and cheek region. But soft tissues and personal characteristics are lost, and no usable ancient DNA from the individuals has restored them. Such reconstructions are interpretations of anatomy, not exact portraits recovered from the past. Once that boundary is understood, the evidence can move beyond the skull. Around the human remains lay stone artifacts belonging to the Middle Stone Age. Many were produced through prepared core methods, in which a stone core was shaped so that later blows would remove flakes of useful and partly controlled form. This required technical knowledge. The toolmaker had to select workable material, prepare the surface, judge angles, and understand how a fracture would travel through the stone. The surviving flint artifacts show repeated familiarity with this process rather than random breakage. The tools do not prove recent forms of engineering or social organization. They do demonstrate planning within a practical task and the ability to produce effective cutting edges. Some of the stone raw material appears to have come from beyond the immediate site. The evidence does not reveal whether it was collected directly, carried between camps, or passed through contacts among groups. It does show that the people using Jebel Irhoud moved through a wider landscape and brought selected materials with them. The excavated deposit was therefore only one point within their world. Animal remains reveal another part of that world. Bones from gazelle and other animals were found in association with the site. Cut marks, breakage, and burning indicate that carcasses were processed by humans. Sharp stone flakes removed tissue, and some bones were broken in ways consistent with obtaining resources such as marrow. These traces provide direct evidence that animal carcasses were processed, but they cannot reconstruct the hunt, identify the people involved, or reveal how food was distributed. A cut mark records an action, not the social life surrounding it. Fire also formed part of the site's practical activity. Heated flint and burned material show that flames were repeatedly present. Fire could have served several ordinary purposes, but the surviving evidence does not identify every use or justify claims of ceremony. Together, the tools, animal remains, and traces of burning establish repeated human activity. People selected stone, produced flakes, obtained and processed animal resources, and used fire within the landscape of northwestern Africa. That landscape should not be confused with modern Morocco simply projected backward. Climate and vegetation changed repeatedly during the Middle Pleistocene. The surrounding environment supported grazing animals and human movement, but water, plant cover, and accessible routes would have shifted over time. The people using the site responded to a landscape that was neither fixed nor identical to the severe environments found in some parts of the region today. The evidence shows competence within those changing conditions. It does not reveal the precise social arrangements that made such competence possible. This is why the word modern must be separated into several meanings. Anatomical characteristics, cranial shape, technological skill, language, subsistence, and symbolic culture are different forms of evidence, and they do not have to appear together. The Jebel Irhoud individuals could possess a broadly Homo sapiens facial structure while retaining an elongated cranial vault. Their prepared core tools, transported stone, and use of fire demonstrate practical competence, but they do not establish language, formal trade, ritual, permanent settlement, or a particular social organization. The archaeological record therefore resists two opposite caricatures. These people should not be reduced to crude figures defined only by their distance from the present. Their tools required learned skill, and their use of resources shows effective adaptation. But they should not be imagined as recent humans placed unchanged into the distant past. The site does not preserve their beliefs, ceremonies, family arrangements, political structures, or forms of expression. The absence of symbolic objects does not settle the question of what they could communicate or remember. Archaeology preserves only part of human life. Stone and teeth endure. Bone sometimes fossilizes. Wood, fiber, hide, plant material, surface decoration, gesture, and speech often leave no lasting trace. A population could possess social bonds, knowledge, and communication that remain archaeologically invisible. Yet missing evidence cannot be replaced by invention. The possibility that behavior failed to survive does not prove that any particular behavior existed. The uncertain parts of the record must remain uncertain. What survives at Jebel Irhoud is limited, but it is enough to create a coherent picture. The faces, jaws, teeth, and cranial vaults preserve biological history. The tools preserve skilled sequences of action. The animal remains preserve food processing. Heated stone and burned bones preserve fire. Raw materials carried from elsewhere preserve movement through a broader terrain. Each line of evidence reveals something different, and none reveals the entire person. Together, they show why the emergence of Homo sapiens cannot be reduced to one threshold. A face did not have to acquire derived characteristics at the same moment that the brain case became globular. A prepared core method did not necessarily arrive with symbolic art. Anatomical classification cannot determine language, and technological competence cannot reconstruct belief. The Jebel Irhoud fossils preserve this separation with unusual clarity. They appear early in the known history of Homo sapiens, yet several features of their faces and teeth resemble conditions retained in later populations. At the same time, their cranial vaults preserve a longer form that differs from the rounded shape characteristic of living humans. The recent human pattern did not appear suddenly. It developed across generations as some characteristics changed while others persisted, spread, or were reshaped through separation and contact among populations. The Jebel Irhoud individuals do not have to be the direct ancestors of every later human population for their evidence to matter. They record one early anatomical combination within a much longer and geographically wider evolutionary process. But a gradual evolutionary process cannot be explained by an isolated fossil group alone. It unfolds through populations moving, separating, adapting, and reconnecting across landscapes and generations. The anatomy found in Morocco must therefore be considered alongside early fossils and Middle Stone Age technologies found in distant regions of Africa. Jebel Irhoud cannot show where every relevant trait first appeared. It establishes that an important combination of Homo sapiens characteristics existed in northwestern Africa at a very early stage. Other sites preserve different combinations in eastern and southern parts of the continent. No single location contains the entire sequence. The face and elongated brain case may therefore represent more than an anatomical mosaic. They may be one local expression of a wider evolutionary landscape, in which different populations carried different combinations of traits. The question is no longer merely when Homo sapiens appeared. It is where this long process was unfolding, and whether evidence scattered across a continent can be explained by one isolated birthplace. Across Africa, the surviving evidence does not form a neat trail leading away from one clearly marked beginning. It appears in widely separated geological settings and through different combinations of anatomy and technology. Jebel Irhoud preserves one early combination in northwestern Africa. Fossils found thousands of kilometers away preserve other parts of the same evolutionary problem. This geographical spread challenged a familiar image, Homo sapiens emerging suddenly, already complete, within one small region of East Africa and only later expanding across the continent. That image was not created without evidence. East Africa contains some of the most important records of human evolution. Its sedimentary basins preserve long sequences of environmental and biological change. Volcanic deposits provide valuable chronological markers, while erosion has exposed ancient layers examined through generations of research. The region remains central to any account of Homo sapiens' origins. What changed was not the value of the East African record, but the size of the map required to explain all the evidence. As discoveries accumulated elsewhere, a single small and permanently isolated birthplace became harder to defend as a complete explanation. This was a refinement rather than a sudden reversal. New fossils, improved dating, wider archaeological investigation, and genetic modeling gradually revealed a history more complex than the popular version of one origin point. The broad African origin of Homo sapiens is not the same claim as the idea that every defining trait appeared in one isolated valley. Structured population or Pan-African models ask whether the process within Africa involved several populations that were separated for long periods but intermittently connected. Jebel Irhoud made that question more difficult to avoid. In Ethiopia, the remains known as Homo preserve crucial early Homo sapiens evidence. Revised analysis of their volcanic context has established a minimum age of approximately 233,000 years. They are younger than Jebel Irhoud, but their anatomy is not simply a later copy of the Moroccan pattern. At Herto, also in Ethiopia, later Middle Pleistocene remains preserve another combination of early Homo sapiens characteristics. They contribute to the same broad history without forming a perfect intermediate stage between Jebel Irhoud and living humans. Farther south, the Florisbad cranium from South Africa, dated to approximately 259,000 years ago, has long occupied an uncertain position. Its mixture of characteristics has produced continuing disagreement over its classification. Some researchers connect it with early Homo sapiens diversity, while others interpret it more cautiously. These fossils cannot be arranged as a simple procession from one region to another. They belong to populations living in different places and at different times. Each specimen preserves only part of the anatomy, and none can automatically be treated as the direct ancestor of the next fossil placed beside it on a map. The Middle Stone Age record is similarly dispersed. Related methods of stone production appeared across northern, eastern, and southern Africa, but they were not identical everywhere. Technologies changed through time, and regional assemblages retained distinct characteristics. Similar methods could spread through population movement, contact, or imitation. They could also arise independently when different groups worked with similar materials and faced comparable practical needs. Stone technology does not carry the biological identity of its makers. Comparable tools cannot by themselves prove direct migration, genetic relationship, or shared culture. Biology, technology, behavior, and population movement can interact, but they do not always follow the same routes. The known evidence therefore resembles a series of preserved windows rather than a continuous record. Through one appears the Jebel Irhoud combination of a relatively derived face and elongated brain case. Through another appears a different anatomical pattern. Elsewhere, only tools survive. Between these windows lie immense regions and long periods for which the evidence remains thin. The distribution of discoveries is not a complete map of where ancient people lived. Fossils survive only under particular conditions. Bones must escape destruction, become buried, mineralize, remain protected, and eventually return to the surface without being erased by erosion. Geology and modern research add further filters. Some ancient deposits are exposed and datable, others remain deeply buried or were destroyed. Certain regions have received generations of excavation, while others are difficult to reach, politically inaccessible, lightly surveyed, or archaeologically underrepresented. A region containing many fossils may have been important, but it may also preserve and expose evidence more effectively. A region with few known fossils cannot automatically be treated as empty. Yet poor sampling is not proof that a particular undocumented population lived there. Even with these limitations, the surviving record suggests substantial human diversity within Middle Pleistocene Africa. A structured population model offers one way to understand it. In this model, Africa did not contain one enormous population mixing freely across the continent. Distance, deserts, forests, mountains, dry ecological zones, river systems, and limited food or water could separate human groups for extended periods. During that separation, populations might preserve or develop partly different anatomical and genetic characteristics. When environmental conditions reopened routes, groups could meet again and exchange genes, technologies, or learned behaviors. Later changes might divide them once more. The result would be a wider network whose connections strengthened, weakened, disappeared, and returned through time. Researchers sometimes call such a system a metapopulation, several distinct populations linked by changing degrees of contact. It does not imply one continent-wide society or a continuously connected genetic population. Africa's climate repeatedly reshaped those connections. The Sahara was not always the severe desert familiar today. Orbital and climatic changes altered rainfall, lakes, rivers, vegetation, animal distributions, and habitable routes across northern Africa. During wetter phases, some regions contained grasslands, lakes, wetlands, and active river systems that could support animals and human movement. During drier periods, those habitats contracted as desert conditions expanded. The Sahara could therefore act as a habitable corridor during some periods and as a filter or major barrier during others. The transformation was never uniform, and no single humid phase explains the complete emergence of Homo sapiens. Other African environments also changed. Rivers shifted, lake basins expanded and contracted, and the boundaries among forests, grasslands, coasts, and highlands moved through time. Populations traveled across a continent whose possible routes were repeatedly being redrawn. This changing geography could extend Mosaic evolution across a far larger scale. A population in northwestern Africa might preserve one combination of traits. A population in eastern or southern Africa might carry another. When contact resumed, genes could pass between groups without making them immediately uniform. Jebel Irhoud captures one moment within that changing network. Rather than pointing to one isolated birthplace, the surviving evidence suggests a long evolutionary process involving populations distributed across Africa. The face once seemed to appear in the wrong place and at the wrong time because the explanatory map was too narrow. The fossil was not out of place. The map used to explain it was too small.